Avram Kolech, the town's bookseller and my great-uncle, knew better than anyone else in Anatevka, Jew or Russian, what was happening beyond the borders of the district. Fluent in Russian, German, Hebrew, and Yiddish, he devoured every book, magazine, and newspaper that passed through Anatevka. Avram was the first in Anatevka to see the coming storms that would soon engulf the Jews of Anatevka and the entire Pale. Every week at Mordka's tavern, he read aloud from the Yiddish paper from Kiev. Half the Jewish men of Anatevka could not read or read poorly, and so packed Mordka's tavern when Avram read the news. For packing the tavern, Mordka provided Avram free drinks. Avram always said that he read the papers in public only because Mordka enticed him with a free bottomless stein of beer. But in truth, he carefully selected his articles to influence the town's opinions. For several years before the expulsion, Avram read aloud the articles about America, Canada, and England that created an image of these countries as the promised land, skipping over the reports about the New York sweatshops and the London slums. At the same time, he read articles which tended to show the suffering of Jews within the Pale of Russia. When the pogroms of 1905 came, half the Jews in Russia, the Ukraine, and Poland stayed inside the Pale. But most of the Jews of Anatevka, having heard Avram for years paint a picture of an American paradise, chose to emigrate to these new, promised lands. Rabbi Izrael Kolech, Avram's older brother and another of my great-uncles, became convinced of his younger brother's fears of persecution were legitimate when, on an autumn day in 1903, Ivan Paparilio, the chief constable, showed him a copy of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, an anti-Semitic pamphlet that claimed that the Jews were trying to take over the world. The chief constable said that the Tsar's secret police had sent him a box of the tracts to distribute throughout the district. The chief constable, while probably believing the pamphlets were true, also thought that distributing them would stir up trouble, and, as the chief of police, he wanted no trouble. So after sharing a copy with the rabbi and a few other town leaders, the chief constable made sure that the tracts were mislaid at the bottom of the stable's compost pile. Rabbi Kolech, however, immediately started collecting train and boat schedules, rate sheets, maps, English, French, and Spanish phrase books. He wrote everyone who had left Anatevka for the West to get accurate information about jobs, housing, wages, and available synagogues. He returned to Kiev, where he had studied as a young man for 5 years and reconnected with old friends. He wrote to every Jewish immigration and relief agency he could locate in North America, Australia, and Western Europe. He even wrote, in Yiddish of course, to the American President Theodore Roosevelt, to King Edward VII of England, and Prime Minister Laurier of Canada for information and help. By the time the villagers left, the rabbi had arranged for entry-level jobs for many of the men in the warehouse district of London and the stockyards of Chicago, jobs that were at least a full step above the sweatshops of New York, and located housing in half a dozen cities that at least had roofs that did not leak. Mordka ran one of the 3 inns in Anatevka. He straddled the world of the Russian, the Jew, and the Cossack. He welcomed everyone into his tavern. A big fellow, muscle-bound in his youth, he had spent a year traveling the Ukraine with a small carnival as a boxer, taking all comers for a few kopecks. In his travels, he learned every dirty wrestling and boxing trick that the other carnival boxers showed him. So when he returned to Anatevka to help in the family tavern, he could bounce anyone who caused trouble, the roughest Cossack, the drunkest Russian kulak, or the brawniest Jewish blacksmith. Mordka's tavern became neutral ground. When the expulsion came, Mordka and his family were offered the right to remain in Anatevka. They did, but only long enough to get something approaching a fair price for the tavern. For those 9 months, he also administered the property of many of the Jewish families who had been expelled. Because Mordka stayed, when Russian scavengers offered mere kopecks to the expelled Jewish families, They could refuse and let Mordka get a few rubles more later. Even though Mordka was always busy tending to his patrons, he kept one ear on Avram as Avram publicly read the news. He decided that England was his promised land, and when he left Anatevka a few months behind the others, he made his way across Europe to England. Avram's meddling with public opinion in Anatevka, the rabbi's preparations, and Mordka's honesty saved the lives of many villagers. Without Avram's stories of the Promised Land, without the rabbi leading, and without Mordka's fair dealings, many villagers would have stayed in Russia and the Pale, starved in the famine of 1932 and 1933, disappeared in the purges of 1936 through 1938, or died in the Holocaust.